The Aussie Report. News and information concerning corruption across Australia. G'day folks, it's Mad Aussie here and welcome to the Aussie Report. So this episode comes with a warning of domestic violence discussion. I'm not going to bring up any graphic videos or pictures and stuff. It's just too much of an impact, and I want to shed light on domestic violence in general, as well as from police officers to their own family, which is sort of an unknown thought for a lot of people, but I've certainly thought about it. What I've got here is a combination of several articles that I've sort of pieced together and edited into one script, and I have done a video on this before, but I didn't like how it was presented, and so I'm having another go at it now. So this begins with: the consequences of police violence are indelible. It impacts communities large and small nationwide. Large because police violence is seen publicly. Small because research data suggests a connection between police violence on the job and police domestic violence at home. Indeed, cops and domestic violence have a strong relationship. As freedom protests began 2 years ago, video after video was released showing law enforcement going after civilians. Shoving, punching, tackling, using tear gas and rubber bullets against the people of Australia. What wasn't seen, though, was what cops do at home. There are those who argue that the police can be trusted always to act in the public interest, protecting and serving the innocent. Surely many do, but research into the private lives of cops suggests that the faith in the restraint of police officers on the job is founded at least in part on men who abuse their wives and children, and what percent of cops are domestic abusers is conspicuously high. Though data on police domestic violence is not only notoriously difficult to gather, but also skewed by a culture of silence and intimidation. It suggests that police officers in the United States, for example, perpetrate acts of domestic violence at roughly 15 times the rate of the general population. Because officers tend to protect their own, domestic victims of violent cops often don't know where to go. Sometimes they reach out to Alex Roslin, who is an author of Police Wife, The Secret Epidemic of Police Domestic Violence. The American Society of Journalists and Authors award-winning book that constitutes perhaps the only major work on this subject. I get emails that would make your hair crawl, says Roslin, a Canadian freelance journalist who came to the issue 2 decades ago after a friend working with survivors of abuse informed him police wives and biker gang spouses constituted the bulk of their patient population, suggesting a hidden epidemic of police domestic abuse. Indeed, police domestic abuse, Roslin points out, is an open secret. In 1991, socialist Lena Johnson presented to the US House of Representatives Select Committee on Children, Youth and Families, suggesting that 360,000 of the then 900,000 law enforcement officers in the US were likely perpetrating acts of abuse. After a Los Angeles Police Department officer murdered his wife and committed suicide in the late 1990s, a review of domestic abuse allegations brought against officers showed that between 1990 and 1997, 227 alleged cases of domestic violence were brought against police officers. Only 91 were sustained, and only 4 resulted in the conviction of criminal charges. Of the 4 convictions, only 1 officer was suspended from duty. He was asked to take 3 weeks off. The major study here was done by a police officer and a sociologist in Tucson, Arizona, working with a collaborator who had studied domestic violence in military families. It wasn't by the police department officially. That study found that 40% of cops reported having participated in domestic violence in the previous year. The research questioned spouses and officers separately with anonymous questions and came up with strikingly similar figures. An FBI advisory board later found that roughly 40% of officers who filled out questionnaires in a number of different settings admitted to being physically violent with their spouses in the previous 6 months. The general population data for a self-reported abuse is close to 4% when people are asked to report on the last 12 months. The numbers are higher for cops who work night shifts. Domestic violence workers say they come in waves. Women who 3 or 4 at a time step forward for help escaping a special class of abuser experts deem particularly high risk, police officers. Often they'll call from out of town. A woman living in a rural community in one of Australia's eastern states recently got in touch with a domestic violence service in a busy city, hundreds of kilometres away. She told the support workers her husband, a cop with specialist training and connections, had assaulted her in front of his colleagues, enlisted his friends and relatives to help her stop leaving, and warned her that if she ever tried to run, he'd track her down, kill her, and bury her someplace her body would never be found. She believed him. At one point, in the elaborate escape plan, the service advised, the woman put her phone on a truck heading north, climbed into a car booked under a fake name, and sped off in the opposite direction. Hers was a particularly tricky case, one of the staff involved explained, because of how isolated she was. But the abuse she experienced and the powerlessness to leave she felt is similar to what other women in violent relationships with police say they endure. Where do you turn when your abuser is part of the system meant to protect you? An ABC News investigation has found police in Australia are too often failing to take action against domestic violence perpetrators in their ranks, fueling a culture of impunity in law enforcement agencies across the country and putting victims' safety at risk. In public, senior police have consistently claimed they hold serving officers to higher standards and even more accountable for committing domestic violence. But behind closed doors, police concede they're treating badged abusers differently to offenders in the broader community. National data on the number of police officers charged with domestic violence, the first time such a snapshot has been compiled, shows state police forces have taken criminal action against relatively few officers. Documents obtained by the ABC under Freedom of Information reveal at least 55 police officers around Australia were charged with domestic violence-related offences in 2019, with charges ranging from breaching protection orders, assault with a weapon and reckless wounding, to strangulation, stalking, sexual assault and making threats to kill. The rank of officers charged ranged from probationary constable to inspector, and the majority were male. Of 41 cases in which the officer's gender is known, 4 were women. In most cases, the information obtained does not identify how many were found guilty or their charges or had convictions recorded. This, what you're seeing on the screen here, is police officers charged with domestic family violence in 2019. Now, this excludes ACT policing and the Australian Federal Police, which would not provide data or documents sought by the ABC. And so, starting off with New South Wales, they charged 11 officers, and their force size is 17,111. Now, remembering what was stated above, is that it appears to be an average of 40% of police officers are committing domestic violence. And so 40% are committing domestic violence, and only 11 officers were charged out of 17,000. Yeah, the numbers are a little off there. And so Victoria is 23 officers charged out of 16,295. Queensland, 14 officers charged out of 12,200. Western Australia, 0 officers out of 7,012. South Australia, 5 officers out of 4,700. Northern Territory, 0 officers out of 1,625. And Tasmania, 2 officers out of 1,274. So, continuing with this article, with evidence suggesting police are at least as likely to perpetrate domestic violence as the general population, experts say the figures are likely to be just the tip of the iceberg, and highlighted how difficult it can be not only for the victims to report abusers in police ranks, but to get police to take action against their own. In the year ending June 2019, for instance, there was roughly 37 domestic and family violence offenders per 10,000 persons in New South Wales. Yet of the more than 17,000 officers employed by New South Wales Police last year, just 11 were charged. The problem that police apply different standards to themselves was discussed last year in a meeting of the National Family Violence Policing Executive Group, which is made up of senior police from all states and territories. The data emerged after Victoria Police analysed 278 family violence incidents involving employees in 2017 as part of a strategy to fix its inconsistent response. The review found criminal matters involving police perpetrators were significantly less likely to result in action being taken. Of all family violence crime, 80% of alleged offenders were processed. That is, they were arrested, charged or cautioned. In family violence matters involving police, however, less than 20% of all alleged offenders were processed. The fact that police responses to family violence are different when the perpetrator is a police officer comes as no surprise, because it is what women who experience this violence have been saying for a long time, Ms. Caulfield said. Women we support tell us that there is a culture of police officers having each other's back that dissuades them from speaking out, or means that when they do, the violence is minimised or excuses are made. There is a focus on the ways reporting abuse could impact the officer's well-being or damage their career instead of on the safety of the women targeted. The following is a sad story of domestic abuse from a child's point of view. This has come out of one of the articles. And this goes on to say, Sam, which is an alias, was 11 when his stepfather, Darren Hannegriff, came home angry. He made a beeline for Sam's room, yelling, "Where is the little C?" But Sam's mum, Jay, another alias, got in the way. Sam later watched as Hannegriff grabbed Jay, dragged her down the driveway, slammed her head against a letterbox and bashed her unconscious. Sam could do nothing. Earlier, he'd promised his mum that if he saw her getting hurt, he would stay out of the way. Sam's job was to protect his little sister. Terrified, but doing his job, he watched thinking Hannegriff was killing his mum. And then Sam watched his mum get up, trying to pretend it hadn't happened. Stumbling, badly bruised, hands shaking, she staggered inside and fell asleep in her children's room. After bashing Jay, Senior Constable Hannegriff left to work a night shift. The next morning, none of them spoke of it. The family ate breakfast together. As a police officer, Hannegriff worked in a system that's supposed to protect victims of family violence. But that's not what shattered Jay's faith in the system. Hannegriff's colleagues did that. Police, who repeatedly pressured Jay not to report him. Make good, they told her. Cook him a nice dinner, give him another chance. Then one evening at the house, Hannegriff's superior officer warned Jay in front of her 2 children that reporting her violent partner might put her in even more danger. A man with nothing to lose is a dangerous man, the sergeant said. After that, Jay's daughter asked her not to press charges. When Jay finally found the courage to make a statement, another officer leaked Jay's secret safety plan to flee with the children to Sydney over to Hanegraaff. That's when he became the man with nothing to lose. He was angrier than ever, more threatening, violent and controlling. Jay's story is part of the family violence specialist and coordinator of the Policing Family Violence Project Lauren Caulfield calls a hidden crisis. But while family violence itself might not be the frontline political issue, its police perpetrators and the fact that they mostly get away with it remains hidden behind layers of denial. In February, Jay became the first Victorian in 5 years to secure a family violence-related criminal conviction against a serving police officer. Across Australia, the statistics suggest that police accused of family violence are treated vastly different to non-police. It's a disparity that has led some victims to tell their stories publicly despite grave risks. So, moving on, the following here is a true story from a wife's point of view. In early 2018, Hazel, again an alias, reported a crime. The community service professional was scared, but the officer she spoke to reassured her he would look after her complaint. Soon after, he emailed her from his personal account and then invited her for coffee. Hazel was weary about a new relationship, but Officer A, as we'll call him, seemed different. He presented as a protector, a policeman who relished serving the public. It seemed to flow very naturally, very easily, very, very quickly, she recalls. They started dating. From early on, Hazel had niggling thoughts that Officer A wasn't quite right, but she put them aside. She believes Officer A started unlawfully using the police database to snoop on her private life and look up her friends and family. He would do drive-bys of her house in his police car and call her if she wasn't home, demanding an explanation. His behaviour was shifting from odd to sinister, and she began feeling confused and suffocated by his erratic mood swings. Then his behaviour escalated. He started becoming controlling and began asserting his physical dominance. At her house, he grabbed and flung her around and locked her in a bathroom. He demanded sexual gratification in a way that left Hazel feeling degraded and sometimes terrified. Hazel tried to break free. He'd beg her to take him back. Then one night, she came home from the hospital after surgery, groggy and weak. She says that during the night, she woke up disorientated and felt his hand around her neck. It's when you're most weak. It's when they or he can get off the most, be the most masculine, be the most in charge, have the most power over you, Hazel recalls, her eyes welling with tears. He raped me in the middle of the night. The most devastating aspect of that, she said, was the reminder of just how small you are, and when you have hands around your throat, how easily you can be snuffed out. There would be other assaults and degradation, including an alleged sexual assault in public, before Hazel finally ended the relationship for good. But she too remained scared to report Officer A to the police. Caulfield says the fear was well-founded. Recent data released by police forces around Australia shows a culture of impunity in which police perpetrators are far less likely to be charged than civilians. In Victoria, civilian domestic violence offenders are 4 times more likely to be arrested, charged or cautioned than perpetrators who are police officers. It is a crisis of community safety, Caulfield says, and a scandal. Most concerning to Hazel, though, was Officer A's claim that he worked as a family violence officer for the police. Hazel believed this allowed Officer A to be on the hunt for vulnerable women. Others in the police force suspected the same thing. In early 2019, a family violence intervention order was taken out by detectives to protect her safety. It didn't work, and he breached the order. Under scrutiny, Officer A quietly resigned from the force. Hazel believes he still has a network of policing contacts, and she remains terrified. She is speaking out only because she wants a record of what happened to her and to help other victims. She also believes there needs to be a properly funded independent body to monitor and watch complaints against police. In Victoria and New South Wales, independent police watchdogs exist, but both are poorly funded and in most cases lack the capacity to oversee complaints, including domestic violence allegations involving officers. Victoria's Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission Chief, former Judge Robert Redlick, has made repeated pleas to the Andrews government for more funding for this purpose, but they haven't been heeded. It's among the reasons why Jay had to fight for 2 years on her own to hold police to account. Police must urgently overhaul the ways it deals with perpetrators of police domestic violence in its ranks. Experts say, with frontline workers claiming the standard practice of police investigating their close colleagues too often means alleged abusers are not being held accountable, putting victims' safety on the line. So thanks for tuning into this one. I've left helplines and numbers and stuff like that across the screen. Links will be in description as well as them helplines and numbers and stuff. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and be safe. Thank you very much.
You could try to play, but you're never gonna beat me. Look the other way, what I'm doing ain't easy. Bloody hands stained from the people who deceive me. Muddy hands break through the chains, go free me.